Everything Russia does is justified by history. But the state demands a single version of that history, one that speaks only in its voice. The official narrative becomes sacred. The history book is permanently locked shut, chained by invisible hands. And anyone who dares say, wait, something doesn't add up, risks backlash, censorship, or even persecution. Official history in Russia does not spark questions, it demands obedience. School books don't explore facts, they enforce narratives. Soviet collapse, Western sabotage. Ukraine invasion, reluctant self defense. Inconvenient truths, they've vanished, padlocked away by the state itself. But today, we are breaking that lock. My name is Elvira Barry. I grew up in the Soviet Union, raised on neatly packaged historical lies, and spent years untangling the truth from the myths. Now, together, we'll explore Russia's greatest historical myths. How they are constructed, why they persist, and what happens when an entire nation's past is hidden behind chains and silence. Before Catherine the Great ordered the first state archive, most Russians carried only scraps of the past in their heads. Saints' lives, the Tsar's name, a half-remembered battle. Towns built of pine and birch burned, rotted, and were rebuilt so often that little survived to anchor memory. Outside the church and the top aristocracy, the record of everyday life simply dissolved in time. Picture a Russian town in the Middle Ages. Chances are what comes to mind is a 19th century painting. That's because the real Russia of those centuries barely survived on the page. The version most of us know was dreamed up later, during the Romantic era, when Europe was busy inventing national identities and Russia wanted its own pedigree. The Russian Empire was expanding. But how do you claim other people's lands? How do you justify occupation and exploitation? You build a narrative. One that declares you a great nation with a heroic past and a glorious future. A story where the ruler is always the main character and anyone who dares oppose him is cast as the villain. Back then, uncovering the truth meant slipping past censors, smuggling in banned books, and risking your freedom just to read something real. Today, thankfully, the danger's gone, at least for me, but the challenge of actual working with all those sources, that's still very real. When I'm preparing these videos and writing my books, I'm constantly digging through huge PDFs. Some are crisp digital files, others are faded scans of old newspapers or government records. Many of them are hundreds of pages long, and if I had to wrestle with clunky tools every time, I'd never get anything published. That's why I'm genuinely happy to introduce UPDF, the second ever sponsor of my channel, and to thank them for creating a special discount just for my viewers. You'll find it at the top of the description and pinned in the comments. I use UPDF 2.0 on my Mac almost daily now. It's not just a PDF viewer, it lets me edit text and images right on the page, highlight and annotate key details, and switch to eye protection mode so I can work late without burning my eyes. When I'm working with older scanned documents, UPDF's OCR feature is a lifesaver. I can search for names, dates, and quotes instantly, then copy them straight into my scripts. And if I need to convert the file to Word, Excel, PowerPoint, or plain text, it's just a couple of clicks. It even has a built-in AI that can summarize long reports, translate foreign texts, explain tricky passages, and turn notes into a mind map. And yes, it supports GPT-5 and DeepSeek R1. Security matters too. I can password protect sensitive files in two different ways: permanently redact lines, rearrange pages, or merge multiple sources without a hitch. And when I'm sharing big files with researchers, the compression tool keeps everything lightweight without losing quality. ePDF works across Mac, Windows, iOS, and Android, and your license covers up to 4 devices. You get lifetime free upgrades, and the cost is about 1/6 of Adobe Acrobat, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want to save time and make working with PDFs painless, check out the special link in the description. It's an easy way to support the channel and make your own work a lot smoother. And now, back to the video. Enter the first professional chroniclers. Vasily Kluchevsky's course in Russian history stitched together a sweeping Tsar-centric storyline, printed at state expense and read aloud in provincial salons to audiences who had never met a historian in their lives. Writers supplied the flesh. Pushkin, Lermontov, and others turned to historical themes because it was the demand of the time. The catch was that Russia's educated class was far closer to its Western colleagues than to the peasants and workers of its own land. They spoke French at the dinner table, quoted Goethe and Byron, and traveled through Paris or Vienna when they could. But the voices of their own serfs, let alone their ancestors, barely registered. The past of ordinary Russians was a foreign country, one the nobility had no passport to enter. Pushkin's Eugene Onegin feels as close to Byron as it does to Russia. Tolstoy seems to echo Trollope, Dostoevsky to mirror Dickens, not because they copied, but because they shared the same cultural air. Writers across Europe borrowed, adapted, and reworked each other's themes and techniques. The parallels aren't proof of imitation, they are signs of a common literary landscape. The same was true for artists. They learned their craft in Italy and France, steeped in antiquity and religious themes. That was their model for what historical painting should be. Yes, they developed their own voices and contributed enormously to the arts, but the fact remains: when official historians, writers, and painters build Russia's glorious past, they weren't reviving memory. They were constructing a distorting mirror, one that reflected Europe's fashions and their own ideas far more than the lives of the people they claimed to portray. The public and the patrons of arts didn't care as long as the novel or painting was pleasing. Censorship took care of the rest, making sure no dangerous work ever reached a wide audience. Economics played its part too. Imagine you're a writer who wants to tell the truth about the occupation of Poland. You spend years on a meticulously researched novel, but it will never see print. If by chance it did, readers would reject it. They didn't want their past shown as it really was. Publishing abroad? Impossible. You can't afford translation, and to foreign publishers, you're nobody. So, in the end, you don't really have a choice. You invest your time in what will pass the censor, sell to the public, and pay the bills. Cheap periodicals and the new railways spread the state-approved canon far and wide. Soon, this imaginary past was repeated so often it began to feel like heritage. Russia's view of Western history was just as distorted. Schools carefully avoided the dangerous chapters. Children copied maps from German atlases and memorized endless lists of monarchs. They studied Greek and Roman philosophers, but never the contemporary thinkers writing about economics, social injustice, or politics. The French and American revolutions were simply off limits. Too risky for classrooms built not to spark ideas, but to manufacture loyal subjects. Anyone curious about serfdom debates or Republican ideas had to learn French or English first and pray that a smuggled book slipped past customs. In Imperial Russia, learning the truth was not a course of study, it was an expensive and often dangerous hobby. During the imperial time, Russian history textbooks present a seamless epic, but that glittering facade rests on a series of load-bearing myths. Strip away the ornament, and you'll find a structure built for one purpose: to justify power, past and present. The first legend is the tale of the Varangians, who, according to the 12th century primary chronicle, were invited to rule the Slavs. Modern scholarship paints a rougher picture. Scandinavian raiders, the Vikings, slipped down the rivers, fortified trading posts, and turned human captives into currency at the slave markets, just as they did in Britain and France. The chronicle's polite invitation looks more like a retrofit to excuse foreign overlords who came for silver and left behind a dynasty. 3 centuries later came another extraction machine, the Mongols, and they did much the same as the Varangians before them. Medieval peasants did not care who robbed them, the Mongols or their own princes. And the princes made sure to keep the Mongols pleased, draining their lands for 200 years. Their thrones were safe as long as the caravans rolled east, heavy with silver, furs, and slaves. After 1453, the Constantinople in Ottoman hands, Moscow's rulers declared themselves heirs to Rome first and second, and wrapped their throne in a mantle of divine succession. The monk Philophedus wrote, "Two Romes have fallen, and a third stands, and a fourth shall not be." The slogan still echoes in today's presidential speeches about a spiritual civilization destined to unite all Eastern Slavs, even though the real Byzantium never assigned that role to Muscovy. The myth of peaceful expansion follows. Official textbooks show Siberia, the Caucasus, and Ukraine sliding gently into the empire as if pulled by gravity. Contemporary accounts instead describe Cossack muskets, epidemics that wiped out up to 80% of some Siberian peoples, and treaties invoked later to portray conquest as family reunion. Russia conquered on foot rather than by sail, but the logic matched that of London or Madrid. Extract resources, police the frontier, rename the landscape. Perhaps the most polished idol is Peter the Great. School murals still show a visionary in naval blueprints. Diaries record a monarch who lost an estimated 100,000 serfs and prisoners of war in the swamps of his new capital. Foreign engineers paid in hard cash built the fleet. Conscripted peasants supplied lives and lumber. This project enriched the treasury and hardened Peter's absolute power, but the bill, measured in broken backs and flooded graveyards, never entered the ledger. Catherine the Great borrowed Peter's stagecraft. She seized power from her reform-minded husband, tightened serfdom with the charter to the nobility, and financed bloody wars from the Baltic to the Black Sea, including the partitions that wiped Poland off the map. Official portraits showed a philosopher queen, but peasants saw something else. Vodka monopolies handed to landlords, serfdom hardened until they were little more than cattle, an oppression so brutal it erupted into a real peasants' war. The 1917 revolution shattered the old narrative, but did not change the underlying architecture. Instead of czars, the story now starred Lenin and the party. By 1937, Joseph Stalin had personally edited a new short history of the USSR, excising rivals, inflating his role, and turning what had been a brutal civil war into a triumphant procession towards socialism. Soviet textbooks insisted that pre-revolutionary capitalists squeezed the masses without mercy. Forgotten were the merchant dynasties, the Morozovs, the Tretyakovs, and many others who built free hospitals, opened art galleries, and funded schools, seeing philanthropy as a civic duty. Their factories may have been paternalistic, but they kept the lights on and laid the foundation for Russia's first wave of industrialization. Without their efforts, Russia might have entered the 20th century in the same condition as China, fragmented, impoverished, and unprepared. When Bolshevik militia seized those factories in 1917, industrial output collapsed to less than one-fifth of pre-war levels. Wages were paid in potatoes, and barter replaced money. War communism proved that labor without management and capital is a wheel without an axle, useful only as firewood. When Russian classrooms describe the Civil War, they show a red tide sweeping effortlessly across the map, as if every blacksmith and milkmaid had chosen Lenin over the Tsar on the same bright morning. Contemporary research tells a messier story. By early 1919, the Reds held Petrograd, Moscow, and rail hubs, and two-thirds of the factories. The Whites clung to the grain fields and long frontier, but were marooned on threadbare branch lines and depended on fading British and French aid. Most peasants prayed only that both armies would march past their villages without hanging the elder or stealing the seed grain. Victory belonged to the side that already owned the workshops, the rolling stock, and the guns left over from the Great War. The Bolsheviks didn't win because the people embraced them. They won because the nation was too exhausted to resist, too broken to survive another civil war. Between 1918 and 1922, famine and epidemic killed more Russians than bullets. An estimated 7 million perished from typhus, dysentery, and the Spanish flu alone, with another 6 million dead of hunger as drought parched the Volga basin. Entire towns dismantled their tram lines for firewood. Hospitals reused dressings until the gauze resembled limp gray parchment. In letters later opened by censors, nurses begged cousins for soap and kerosene, while village elders recorded the burial of every third child. Under those conditions, talk of organized anti-Bolshevik risings is wishful myth-making. Out of the chaos, a new article of faith emerged. The Communist Party could not be wrong, because Marxism-Leninism was a science. To question it was not dissent, it was heresy. Another myth took root, that anyone descended from nobility, merchants, clergy, or pre-revolutionary officials was automatically a villain, an exploiter at heart, no matter who they really were. These people were turned into second-class citizens without committing any crime. The state treated them like pests. I've made a video about this strange system, but if you want to go deeper and understand the personal stories behind it, read my historical novel, The Prince of the Soviets. The link is in the description. Needless to say, the official version of Soviet history left out the Gulag entirely. Its role in the economy, in power struggles, in wars, in shaping entire generations. And from that silence, a convenient denial grew. Even today, many insist the Great Terror was exaggerated. After all, if I never heard about it as a child, it couldn't have been that bad, right? Archival tallies compiled by Oleg Livnyuk show otherwise. Roughly 682,000 people were executed on political charges in 1937, 1938 alone. And at Stalin's death, 2.5 million remained in camps, prisons, or exile. About 3% of the entire population. Millions more had perished earlier in collectivization, deportations, and tolling on Arctic rail beds that would never be finished. The Gulag was an economy within the economy, and its footprint stretched from the forests of Karelia to Sakhalin. Under Leonid Brezhnev, a new sanctum emerged, the Great Patriotic War of 1941-1945. Monuments to veterans multiplied, Victory Day parades grew more elaborate, and textbooks lingered lovingly on tales of battlefield glory, while skipping the famine, the Gulag, and the mass deportations that followed. Historians now call it a war cult, a way to manufacture pride without inviting dangerous questions. And it worked. As a child, I loved World War II stories. Heroism, sacrifice, noble deeds, soldiers rescuing children, dogs, and kittens from smoldering ruins. But no one ever told me about the execution of Polish POWs, or how the Soviets, while retreating, burned food and fuel so civilians had nothing left. No one mentioned the atrocities Soviet soldiers committed in the occupied territories, or the refugee ships sunk by Soviet submarines. And certainly, not the fate of Soviet POWs who survived Nazi camps only to be sent to the Gulag by their own government. The logic was simple. If you surrendered, you were a traitor. The war was not taught as a national catastrophe. It was presented like an epic fantasy, like a modern-day video game, where our beautiful heroes vanquish monstrous enemies. Official memory of the war still rests on one foundational lie, that it began on June 22, 1941, when Hitler treacherously attacked peaceful Soviet cities. Quietly erased are the 21 months before that, when the USSR invaded Finland and stood side by side with Nazi Germany, dividing Poland and occupying the Baltic states. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact carved out Stalin's ambitions long before Operation Barbarossa began. Historians still debate whether Stalin planned to strike Germany first, but no credible chronicle denies that Soviet troops were massing at the border. Today, Putin builds his ideology on the same war cult. In his version, the West has always wanted to destroy Russia for no reason at all. The proof? Nazis came from the West. So 80 years later, history repeats itself, and Putin simply struck first to save the nation from another invasion. What no one mentions is that the UK and the USA were Soviet allies during World War II and provided enormous aid. But that detail does not fit the script. The new story goes like this. Our glorious ancestors saved the world from the Nazis, and the only ones protecting that sacred truth today are our current rulers. Which means anyone who opposes them is not just a political opponent. They are enemies of our ancestors, enemies of the truth, and enemies of Russia. This cult of the Great Patriotic War is the regime's anchor. That's why it pretends to care about history and the fallen. That's why insulting a World War II monument is now a felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. These laws aren't about protecting statues. They are about silencing even modest questions about the darker chapters of the war. And sacrifice follows naturally. Television anchors wrap reports of dead soldiers in the language of the 1941. Ukraine becomes the new Stalingrad. Hardships are rebranded as the price of defending the motherland. In speech after speech, Putin casts Russia as the last bastion of traditional morality. Church, war, and regime folded into one sanctum. Dissent becomes blasphemy. Put it all together, cheap pride, manufactured fear, enforced sacrifice, and sacred symbols, and you get a selective history weaponized for power, a tool of governance disguised as national memory. Seen from a distance, the pattern is unmistakable. Every Russian regime inherits the historical edifice from the one before, tears out the pieces that don't fit, repaints the facade, and declares the structure eternal. The furniture shifts, the slogans change, but the blueprint stays the same. History as a column of heroic leaders guiding a suffering people. And if you want to understand today's Russia, you have to see the cracks in that facade, the ones its painters work hardest to hide. Nostalgia insists that everyday life in the USSR was comfortable if modest. Ask the record. In 1965, only one urban household in three owned a refrigerator. Washing machines were so scarce that Khrushchev paraded space age prototypes on newsreels to prove progress that few citizens would enjoy. Color photographs were a studio luxury until the late 1980s, and a family sedan remained beyond reach of most engineers, doctors, or even army colonels. My grandfather, a plant director, still had to heat water on a wood stove. My parents, both engineers, borrowed money from their own parents almost every month just to buy food and clothes. Anything beyond that was a luxury we rarely even considered. Another cherished boast says the USSR was the world's most literate and therefore most enlightened society. Literacy rates were indeed high, but the Iron Curtain sealed off much of 20th century scholarship. Foreign journals vanished into special collections accessible only with secret police permission. Surveys of adult reading habits in the 1970s found that most Soviet citizens turned to detective stories or patriotic historical fiction. Meanwhile, nonfiction books on philosophy, sociology, and modern economics were simply unavailable. Mathematicians and physicists did excel, but only because their textbooks weren't subject to ruthless censorship like humanities works. Fast forward to the present, and another myth prevails. Vladimir Putin raised Russia from its knees. The ledger reads differently. Independent tallies put Russian dead and wounded in Ukraine at more than 790,000, with the National Wealth Fund's liquid reserves down by 70% since the invasion. Finland and Sweden, spooked by Kremlin rhetoric, abandoned decades of neutrality and joined NATO. The alliance now guards an additional 1,300 kilometers of Russian border. Western sanctions have slashed technology imports and forced the finance ministry to plug its budget with domestic debt while inflation chews through household savings. What looks like revival is, on closer inspection, a mortgaged future. One of Putin's propaganda's favorite fairy tales is that the West is rewriting history. Translated, that simply means our neighbors refuse to accept the version of history that flatters our ego and pleases our rulers. But the habit of denying uncomfortable facts is as strong as ever. Mention the Lithuanian civilians crushed by Soviet tanks in January 1991 or thousands of Chechen civilians killed in the 1990s, and many listeners respond with charges of Russophobia. In Russia, the self is fused so tightly to the state that criticism feels like treason, even when directed at long-dead authority figures. Yet history ignored tends to return as a crisis. Whether the reckoning arrives through a military mutiny, a fiscal collapse, or a slow descent into isolation like Iran's, the outcome will punish ordinary Russians first. Myths make comforting shelter, but sooner or later the storm blows through the cardboard walls. If this video opened your eyes to the hidden truths behind Russia's historical myths, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. To support my work directly, you can click Join, send a super thanks, or buy me a coffee using the link or PayPal button below. At the end of this video, you'll see a special thank you to my supporters from PayPal. It's your generosity that empowers me to tell these stories honestly and without compromise. Thank you for watching, and remember, history belongs to those brave enough to question it.